I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had opened thousands of royal papers in his lifetime, but this one stopped him cold. Hidden among Prince Philip's sealed private correspondence was a final letter bearing instructions that had never reached the throne. Charles read the same sentence twice, lowered the page, and remained completely silent. Philip had named Lady Louise Windsor his true royal heir, and suddenly, the king's understanding of his father's final wishes began to collapse. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stayed alone with the letter, until he understood what his father had done. The sealed private correspondence, personal papers kept away from ordinary royal records, contained Philip's instruction that Louise should inherit his legacy of service, discipline, papers, and family responsibilities. It did not change the constitutional line of succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the crown. William's future remained untouched. The words cut because Philip had chosen one person to carry something intimate than rank. The king set his glasses beside the page and pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. "Father," he whispered, then read the sentence again. Pride rose first. Charles remembered Louise as the quiet granddaughter who listened when Philip spoke, and never pushed herself forward. Pain followed. His father had seen something lasting in her, something strong enough to name in a hidden letter, and never explained that judgment to his son. Charles turned the envelope over, and noticed a handwritten instruction beneath the seal. The message said, "They must remain closed until the family confuses rank with duty." Those words changed everything. Philip had not written in nostalgia. He had anticipated conflict. He had feared that position, title, and visibility might one day matter more to the family than service itself. The monarch searched the bundle again, and found a separate sheet missing from the numbered sequence. An archive note, a written record explaining how sealed royal material must be handled, confirmed that the second page had been removed and marked only for Lady Louise. Charles was not permitted to open it. Louise alone could read whatever Philip had left there. Charles reached for the bell, then stopped before summoning her. One question burned through the grief. He called the senior keeper responsible for the sealed papers and asked quietly, who else knew? The custody record gave him names, dates, and one family connection he had not expected. The king lowered the file. This secret had never belonged only to the archive. And as Charles struggled with what his father had written, the far more painful question was becoming unavoidable. Why had Philip chosen Louise above everyone else? Lady Louise had never fought to stand at the center of the royal stage. That was precisely what made Philip notice her. While titles, positions, and public attention pulled other members of the family into endless tension, Louise developed a different bond with her grandfather. One built through silence, carriage driving, stubborn discipline, and conversations few others ever heard. To Charles, the letter was shocking. To those who remembered Philip closely, the name Louise carried another meaning entirely. Louise had learned carriage driving beside a man who demanded patience before praise. Carriage driving, the competitive handling of horse-drawn carriages, was never a ceremonial pastime to Philip. He treated it as a test of control, judgment, and calm under pressure. She understood that quickly. Edward and Sophie had also protected their daughter from constant royal attention, giving her space to grow without being pushed into every public role. That independence mattered because Philip distrusted people who chased importance before earning responsibility. Louise still remembered one private afternoon when her grandfather corrected her sharply after she mishandled a turn. She said nothing dramatic. She reset her hands and tried again. Philip watched her complete the route, then placed one hand briefly on her shoulder. "Dignity is continuing when nobody applauds," he told her. The words stayed with her. Years later, Charles now saw that moment differently. His father had not simply been teaching technique. He had been studying character. Charles felt the realization deepen as he reread the hidden letter. Philip's choice had not been sudden, emotional, or sentimental. The king understood that his father had watched Louise over years, while the wider family barely noticed. That truth brought pride, but it also hurt. Philip had formed a private judgment about the future of his own legacy, and Charles had never been invited into that thinking. Sophie then recalled a strange conversation preserved in her personal diary. Philip had once asked whether Louise understood the cost of carrying something that cannot belong to you. She had dismissed it as one of his harder philosophical questions. Edward added something worse. In a documented family account kept after his father's final decline, he recorded that Philip had requested a private list of Louise's charitable interests and gave no reason for needing it. Charles compared those memories with the date on the sealed letter. His expression changed. Philip had drafted it only days after one explosive family ceremony at Windsor. Suddenly, the hidden choice looked less like a grandfather's affection and more like a warning, written after something personal had broken. The date was no coincidence, because one royal gathering had convinced Philip that the family's understanding of duty was beginning to fracture. Every hidden decision has a moment that starts it. For Philip, that moment came during a private Windsor family service, marking his retirement from active royal duty. What should have been an evening of gratitude became something colder. He watched relatives discuss future rooms, future precedents, and future positions before the ceremony had even properly ended. Then Louise did one simple thing in an empty corridor, and Philip made a private decision that would reach Charles years later. Philip heard the argument before anyone realized he was close enough to listen. The private family service, a closed gathering marking his withdrawal from regular public duties, had been meant to honor decades of service. Instead, several senior relatives argued over ceremonial roles, meaning formal duties performed during royal occasions, and access to responsibilities once linked to the aging duke. Their words mattered because they spoke about his future absence while he was still present. Worse, they spoke as though duty were property, waiting to be divided. Philip walked away without confronting them. An aide followed and offered to gather the family for the planned private toast, but he refused. The duke's disappointment showed in his silence. He had spent years demanding discipline from others, yet now he had heard rank disgust before responsibility, and position before purpose. That moment stayed with him. Louise knew nothing of the argument. She found her grandfather's carriage notebook lying in a quiet corridor and recognized it immediately. The small book carried private training notes connected to the sport they both loved. She did not open it. She waited outside Philip's room for nearly 40 minutes, holding it until he finally appeared. Philip looked at her, then at the notebook. "Why not give it to an aide?" he asked. Louise answered simply. "It belonged to him," she said, "so it should return to him untouched." The Duke said nothing for several seconds. Then his expression softened. The same family that had just argued over access had been contrasted, without knowing it, by a young woman who refused even to open something that was not hers. Philip requested personal stationery that night. His private secretary later recorded the moment in a documented household account, noting that the Duke wrote one opening sentence before pausing. "Inheritance without character is only possession." He then began drafting the hidden letter. Philip sealed 2 envelopes before retiring. The secretary witnessed one marked for a future sovereign and another exclusively for Louise. The Duke ordered both withheld, while the family tensions remained temporary. Years later, Charles studied the names connected to that Windsor argument and felt his stomach tighten. Some still carried influence, and now one of them wanted to know exactly what Philip had given Louise. What began as Philip's private judgment was about to become a family confrontation, and Charles could no longer protect the letter with silence. The door closed. No aides remained. No private secretary stood ready to soften the language. Charles held Philip's letter in one hand, while Edward and Sophie sat opposite him, both already aware that something extraordinary had happened. Louise had not yet been brought into the room. Then Edward looked directly at his brother and asked the question Charles had been delaying. "Did father actually name my daughter?" The king's answer changed the atmosphere instantly. Charles said yes. The monarch had arranged this private meeting because Louise's parents needed to understand the truth before she heard it herself. True royal heir, he explained, referred to Philip's personal legacy and a private family trust of duty. a responsibility built around preserving his values and selected work. It did not change the crown or the constitutional succession, the legal order deciding who becomes monarch. William remained untouched. But the words were deliberate, and Charles knew their emotional force could divide the family if handled carelessly. Edward pushed his chair back sharply. "Read it exactly," he demanded. Charles hesitated, then looked down at the page and spoke Philip's sentence aloud. The anger left his brother's face almost at once. Edward sat motionless. Grief replaced frustration, because this was no longer an argument about wording. His father had thought about Louise, judged her character, and made a decision without ever explaining it to his son. Sophie leaned forward. "What happens to her now?" she asked. Her voice remained controlled, but Charles heard the fear beneath it. She knew Louise had never asked to become the center of a royal contest. The trusted confidant worried that one sentence could turn her daughter into a symbol others might attack. Charles admitted that was exactly his fear. Philip had chosen Louise partly because she had never chased influence, yet the choice itself could now force influence upon her. Charles finally revealed what the letter carried. Louise would receive first stewardship, the leading responsibility for protecting and organizing something entrusted to another person, over Philip's private carriage records, selected correspondence, mentoring principles, and a future family service foundation built around his values. The king watched Edward carefully, as each responsibility was named. Edward then broke his silence through a private recorded conversation kept for the family account. Philip had once told him, "The quiet one may be left with the heaviest burden." He had assumed his father was speaking generally. Now Edward understood. Charles decided Louise must hear everything directly from him. But before she arrived, a senior palace figure challenged whether Philip's wording should carry official force. The family had accepted Philip's words emotionally, but inside the palace, another battle was beginning over who had the power to make those words matter. Royal power rarely announces itself with shouting. Sometimes it appears as a carefully placed folder, a delayed signature, or one sentence altered before a meeting begins. As Charles sat with Philip's letter before him, advisors warned that recognizing Louise too formally could create confusion. The king listened without interruption. Then one courtier used the phrase, "symbolic only." Charles lifted his eyes from the table, and the emotional son disappeared behind the authority of the monarch. Charles held the decisive authority over how Philip's private legacy would be recognized inside the royal household, meaning the staff and structures that support the monarch and working family. Legal advisors still had to protect constitutional clarity because the line of succession, the lawful order deciding who inherits the crown, could not be confused with a personal family inheritance. Palace officials feared the words, "true royal heir," would be seized upon as a challenge to William's future. They wanted the letter treated as sentimental, powerful in private, but limited in practice. Charles heard them out until one advisor suggested removing Philip's exact wording from the internal record. The king placed his palm over the page. His anger never became loud. That made it heavier. "My father's words will not be rewritten for convenience," he said. The advisor fell silent. For Charles, this mattered, because changing the phrase would protect the palace while weakening Philip's final judgment. And the monarch had already spent too many hours wondering whether his father expected that very response. William entered the discussion cautiously and immediately noticed the strain in Charles's face. The prince asked to read the surrounding instructions before offering any opinion. When he finished, he did not challenge Louise's role. He told his father that Philip had always separated inherited rank from earned trust. William understood the danger to succession language, but he also understood why erasing the meaning would betray the man who wrote it. Charles ordered a complete review of the instructions. The documented legal examination uncovered one sentence hidden deeper in Philip's wording. Louise's inheritance was not of throne, but of standard. The phrase changed the argument. Philip had anticipated confusion. He was not naming a sovereign. He was naming the person he believed could preserve a moral standard of discipline and service. Charles reached for the private royal family directive, a written internal order used to formally recognize family responsibilities, and signed it. Louise became primary steward of Philip's designated personal legacy collection and future service program. William watched the pen leave the page. The decision was real, but Louise still had not opened the second sealed page. Charles looked toward the envelope and felt the old fear return. Whatever Philip had written directly to her could change far more than a duty. With the king's pen finally set down, the argument over Philip's wishes ended. But the consequences for Louise were only beginning. Louise entered expecting a family conversation. She left her handbag beside the chair, greeted Charles quietly, and looked toward her parents for some clue. Nobody smiled. The king placed Philip's sealed envelope in front of her and explained, carefully, what had been found. For several seconds, she did not touch it. Then Charles repeated the words, "True royal heir." Louise's face changed. Her hand reached toward the envelope, and suddenly pulled back. Louise listened as Charles told her the truth himself. Philip had selected her to carry forward his private legacy of service and stewardship, the responsibility of protecting work, values, and personal records entrusted to someone else's care. The choice did not alter the constitutional succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the crown. Her place had not changed, yet the meaning was enormous, because Philip had singled her out from a family shaped by duty. Edward and Sophie stayed silent while the king spoke. Her parents understood that Charles was explaining the letter both as sovereign and as a son still wounded by his father's final judgment. Louise looked from the monarch to the envelope and asked why. So many senior royals had served for decades. Why her? Her voice broke before the question ended. "What if I disappoint him?" she whispered. The pain was simple and brutal. Philip could no longer correct her, challenge her, or tell her to try again. Sophie moved closer, but Louise lifted one hand and asked for space. The trusted confidant stopped immediately. Her daughter stared at Philip's handwriting and fought tears. "I'd rather have one more carriage lesson," she said, "than inherit anything he owned." Edward lowered his eyes. Charles said nothing, because every answer suddenly felt too small. Louise finally opened the second page. Philip's instruction was direct. If the responsibility ever became a source of vanity, she should refuse it. He had given her freedom to walk away. The words shook her, because they proved he had not left a command. He had left a test. Louise read the final handwritten line twice. Philip instructed her to seek Charles personally if the family begins serving the institution before remembering why the institution must serve. The institution meant the monarchy itself, the system of crown, duty, and public service surrounding the sovereign. Charles heard his father's warning return through Louise's voice. Louise folded the page. She looked at Edward, then Sophie, and finally at the king. "I need to answer him," she said. Then she asked everyone else to leave. For the first time, there would be no parents, courtiers, or palace advisors between Charles and Louise, only two members of a family carrying Philip's unfinished words. When the room emptied, Charles expected Louise to ask about titles, responsibilities, or public announcements. She asked none of those things. Instead, she held Philip's letter against her lap and said, "Did grandfather think the family had lost its way?" The king did not answer immediately. No secretary could draft a response for him. No constitutional explanation could protect him. In that private silence, Charles finally spoke to Louise not as king, but as Philip's grieving son. Charles sat opposite her with no advisor, parent, or courtier between them. The absence mattered, because every earlier conversation had been shaped by royal machinery. An institutional buffer meant the people and procedures that normally protect senior royals from speaking too personally. Now there was none. The monarch admitted Philip had feared duty would become confused with position, visibility, and personal entitlement as younger generations struggled to define where they belonged. Charles lowered his voice and confessed something he had told nobody. The letter had hurt him. For one terrible moment, he had wondered whether his father had judged him and found him inadequate. Louise listened without interrupting. Then she told him Philip's choice did not erase what he expected from his son. The Duke had trusted Charles with the crown and the burden of leadership. He had simply trusted her with a different piece of himself. Louise looked down at the page and admitted she wanted to refuse. Accepting Philip's responsibility felt too much like standing above her cousins, and she could not bear the idea of becoming a rival figure inside the family. Charles almost smiled through the sadness. That discomfort, he told her, was exactly why Philip had chosen her. Someone hungry for the role would have misunderstood it before beginning. Louise then gave her answer. She would accept stewardship, the duty of protecting and guiding something entrusted to her, but only on one condition. Philip's future program could not promote her as a competing royal figure, and true heir could never become a public title attached to her name. Charles agreed immediately. The king made his own decision. Philip's exact letter would remain preserved, untouched, within the private family record. But Louise's work would be defined by service rather than ceremonial elevation, meaning no higher rank, special public precedence, or manufactured status would come with it. For a moment, the pain between them eased. Then a private aide entered with an urgent media briefing. Philip's wording had leaked before the palace could explain it. By morning, 3 explosive words would dominate a national front page. Louise had found a way to carry Philip's legacy without claiming his spotlight. But outside the palace, the words, "true royal heir," were already impossible to contain. By sunrise, Philip's private words were no longer private. At a London newspaper kiosk, the front page carried a photograph of Louise, beside one enormous headline, "Philip's true royal heir." Commuters stopped. Phones appeared. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered before midday, debating what the phrase meant. Inside the palace, Louise saw the headline on a tablet, closed the cover immediately, and realized the responsibility she had accepted in silence was now national conversation. Louise felt the meaning twist almost at once. Media coverage focused on true royal heir, forcing the palace to explain that Philip's letter concerned his personal legacy and did not alter the constitutional succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the crown. That distinction mattered because William's future had not changed, yet careless headlines made the family appear divided. Broadcasters also revisited Louise's quieter royal life, her carriage-driving connection with Philip, and the years she had spent outside the fierce center of public attention. Louise called Edward after hearing one presenter suggest she had somehow displaced senior royals. Her father listened as she said she would withdraw completely if Philip's memory became ammunition in a family contest. Edward reminded his daughter that walking away in panic could also allow others to define the letter for her. Louise understood the warning, but the pain remained. She had accepted responsibility to honor her grandfather, not to defeat anyone. Charles watched a television discussion in silence as another presenter questioned why Philip had trusted someone so young. The king reached for the remote and switched off the screen. William sat nearby, saying nothing, until his father finally spoke. Charles admitted Philip would have hated the contest around the phrase, but the Duke would have understood the lesson beneath it. The future king agreed. Trust, he said, had never been measured by age alone. Charles authorized the palace to release Philip's clarifying words from the documented letter, not of throne, but of standard. The phrase changed the conversation. Public debate moved away from succession and toward character, discipline, and service. People began asking not what Louise had inherited, but why Philip had believed she could protect it. Outside Windsor, one moment captured that shift. A former carriage driving club member placed a handwritten card near the gates. He taught her the reins. She understood the responsibility. Louise later saw the message in a documented media briefing and remained silent. Charles saw the same image. This time, the monarch did not turn away. He called for Philip's letter and made one final decision about how the choice would be remembered. The public had finally understood that Philip was not choosing another monarch, and Charles was ready to give his father's final judgment its permanent meaning. Charles returned to Philip's letter one final time, but the pain he felt when he first opened it had changed. He no longer read the words as a hidden judgment against himself or a dangerous challenge to the family. He read them as his father's final lesson. Philip had spent a lifetime surrounded by rank, protocol, and inherited position. Yet when deciding who should protect his most personal royal legacy, he chose the granddaughter who had never demanded to inherit anything. Charles ordered the original letter permanently preserved within the private royal family collection, a protected archive holding personal documents kept for the family's historical record. The king added a clear written note explaining that Louise's designation concerned stewardship, values, and Philip's personal legacy, not constitutional succession. That distinction mattered because no throne had changed hands and William's future remained untouched. What changed was the family's understanding of what could be inherited without a crown. The monarch also confirmed Louise's leadership of the Philip Legacy Service Program. The program, a family initiative built to continue selected areas of his work, would focus on discipline, practical service, youth development, and preservation of the Duke's carriage heritage. Louise accepted the responsibility quietly. She asked for no ceremony and no public elevation. Charles then gathered the family one final time and placed Philip's carriage notebook before Louise. She recognized it immediately. It was the same notebook she had once returned unopened at Windsor. Her hands tightened around it, and she struggled to control her tears. Edward watched his daughter in silence, while Sophie reached for his hand and held it. Charles looked directly at Louise. He told her Philip had not chosen her because she was prepared to be important. He had chosen her because she understood that importance was never the purpose. The words broke through the last of her restraint. Louise lowered her eyes, still holding the notebook, while the king finally understood his father. Charles then revealed, through the final written family directive, that true royal heir had been removed from all promotional language at Louise's own request. A royal directive meant an internal written decision formally guiding family responsibilities. Philip's exact words, however, would remain untouched in the historical record. Louise's refusal to exploit them had become the final proof of why he selected her. The king's old wound finally closed. Philip had not replaced his son, challenged William, or rewritten succession. He had entrusted one part of himself to someone he believed would never turn duty into power. Louise accepted the notebook without a new title, elevated rank, or public claim. Philip's letter changed no throne. It changed the meaning of inheritance. And that was Philip's final message to Charles, Louise, and the monarchy itself. The crown may pass by succession, but the deepest legacy must always be earned. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.